The markets for factors of production. This is the first of a 3-chapter sequence that examines the distribution of income and related issues. This chapter develops a neoclassical theory of income distribution in which each factor of production earns a price that equals the value of its marginal product. This chapter builds on the concepts from earlier chapters, specifically the chapter entitled The Cost of Production in Firms in a Competitive Market, or Firms in Competitive Markets, I should say. Those chapters should be covered, obviously, before this one, so make sure you've gone through that material first. And if you've learned that material, you'll have very little issues, very little problems, very little issue with this chapter. So, factors of productions and factor markets. Factors of productions are the inputs used to produce goods and services. Examples include labor, land, and capital. The equipment, capital is the equipment and structures used to produce goods and services. Okay, I think it's pretty intuitive what labor and land is, but capital again is the equipment and structures used to produce goods and services. So think about the factory and the machines in the factory as capital. Prices and the quantities of these inputs are determined by supply and demand for factor markets. So basically there is a market for the inputs that producers need to produce an output. Now, with this we talk about derived demand. Now, markets for factors of productions are like markets for goods and services, just like we've been talking about so far, except for there's a demand for a factor of production, and that's known as a derived demand. Derived demand from a firm's decision to supply a good in another market. So they have a derived demand for factors of production. Now, we make two assumptions here. The first one is that all markets are competitive. The typical firm, when we're talking about factors of production, we're going to assume that all markets are competitive. The typical firm is a price taker. Again, it's competitive. The firm is the buyer in this example and is a price taker. So they're in the market for a product it produces, and they're in the labor market as well to hire people to produce the product that it produces. The second assumption is that firms care only about maximizing profits. Pretty safe assumption for the most part. Each firm's supply of output and demand for inputs are derived from its goal, which is to maximize profits. Very simple assumptions. So let's get into an example. Now this is an example we used in chapter 13 to introduce the following concepts: production function, marginal product of labor, diminishing marginal product. Now here we briefly review these concepts and then use it to derive Farmer Jack's demand for labor. So his input that he's going to need is labor. So Farmer Jack, he sells wheat in a perfectly competitive market. Remember, perfectly competitive market, there's a lot of suppliers, a lot of buyers, and identical products. A commodity like wheat fits perfectly into a perfectly competitive market. He hires workers in a perfectly competitive labor market. So there's lots of people willing to work, lots of people willing to hire labor in a perfectly competitive labor market. When deciding how many workers to hire, Farmer Jack maximizes his profits by thinking at the margin. That's one of our principles from chapter 1. If the benefit from hiring another worker exceeds the cost, Jack will hire that worker. In other words, he gains more benefit than cost by hiring another worker. He's thinking at the margin. He's going to do it. Now, the cost of hiring another worker is the wage, which is the price of labor. So what they have to pay that worker. All right. The benefit of hiring another worker, Jack can produce and sell more wheat and increase his revenue. So he has more output by hiring one more input, one more unit of labor. The size of this benefit depends on Jack's production function, which is the relationship between the quantity of inputs used to make a good and the quantity of output of that good. Now, here is, not to be confused with the production possibilities frontier, here is the production function, again, which is the relationship between the quantity of inputs used to make a good and the quantity of outputs of that good. So again, quantity of inputs, i.e. the number of workers, and the quantity of output. So that relationship is a production function. At 0 workers, he makes 0 bushels of wheat. 1 worker, he makes 1,000 bushels a week, on up to 5 workers and 3,000 bushels a week. Okay, so we have a graphical relationship here. Connect the dots, my favorite childhood game. Now, the marginal product of labor, MPL. Marginal product of labor is the increase in the amount of output from an additional unit of labor. So you add one more worker, how much output do you get? You have a change in labor. Let's say you add one more worker, how much additional output do you get from adding that one person? So delta Q here is the change in output. Delta L is the change in labor. Now, the value of marginal product. Here's a problem. The cost of hiring another worker, the wage, is measured in dollars. But the benefit of hiring another worker, the marginal product of labor, is measured in units of output, in this case, bushels of wheat. The solution is to convert the marginal product of labor to dollars, so everything's on a dollar scale. That leads to us calculating the value of marginal product. The marginal product of an input times the price of the output. Okay. In this example, the value of marginal product of labor is the value, or VMPL is the abbreviation for the value of marginal product of labor, is simply the price you can get for the bushels of wheat times the marginal product of labor. So if you hire one more worker and you get 1,000 more bushels of wheat, you take the price of wheat and multiply by that 1,000 that you get to hire another worker, and you have your value of marginal product. Now let's work through an example to illustrate this. So this exercise is not difficult, but sometimes you might be more likely to remember how to compute marginal product of labor and the value of marginal product of labor if you do it yourself instead of just watching me show these results. So what I'm going to do is pause for a minute, or ask you actually to pause the video, pull out a sheet of paper and make these calculations for yourself, just so you can prove to yourself that you can make it. You've computed a lot of marginal things in preceding chapters, so you should be able to do this exercise using only the definitions for marginal product of labor and value of marginal product of labor from the previous slides if you need to rewind a little bit. So the price I'm going to give you here is $5 a bushel. Okay, you need to find the marginal product of labor and the value of the marginal product of labor and fill them in these blank spaces here. You can just take a piece of paper and write them down. Going from 0 to 1 workers, 1 to 2 workers, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, 4 to 5. So you're always adding one more worker. How many more bushels of wheat are you getting? And multiply it by 5, and you can get the marginal product. Okay. Marginal product obviously would be 1,000 here, 800 here, so on and so forth. The value of labor would be that 1,000 times the $5 per bushel, the 800 times the $5 per bushel. I want you to pause the video and make those calculations for yourself. Then we can graph a curve with the value of the marginal product of labor on the vertical axis and labor on the horizontal axis. Again, the production function. So take a minute, pause, make those calculations. Okay, we're back. Answers. Farmer Jack's production function exhibits a diminishing marginal product, which means that marginal product of labor falls as labor increases. This property, the diminishing marginal product property, is very common actually. As you can see here, the change in quantity and given the change in labor, so we go from 0 workers to 1, we get 1,000 bushels out of that move. But going from 1 to 2, we get 800. From 2 to 3, we get 600. From 3 to 4, we get 400. And from 4 to 5, we get 200. So you see, as we add more workers, we are getting more bushels of wheat, but we're increasing at a decreasing rate. Okay, 1,000, 800, 600, 400. Then we're adding a 5th worker at 200. Eventually, you have a negative return. Now, converting that to values, we simply take our price of $5, multiply it by our marginal product of labor, and we just have the value, which is the price times the marginal product of labor, 5 times 1,000, 5 times 800, 5 times 600, and you can see that the values are also diminishing. Okay. So Farmer Jack's value of marginal product of labor curve is downward sloping due to the diminishing marginal product that we illustrated on the last slide. So you just fill in your dots here and connect the dots. Okay, now suppose the wage for a worker, the wage big W, is $2,500 a week. Okay, how many workers should Jack hire? Okay, all right. For some reason there's a overlap in my language here. Apologize for that. I don't know why that's in there. the at any smaller, the answer here, ideal answer, is hiring a labor force of 3 workers. Now that I've gotten that fixed. So we have a wage of $2,500 a week. How many workers should Jack hire? We're going to say that the labor here should be 3. At any smaller labor pool, at any smaller labor, can increase profit by hiring another worker, okay? So you may wonder why we're measuring the wage in dollars per week rather than dollars per hour. The answer is, our task here is to compare the cost and benefit of hiring an extra worker. At the benefit, price times marginal product of labor, that's the extra revenue per week from having one more worker. Now recall, the production function, hence the marginal product of labor, are measured in units per week. So we're getting everything on the same page here. So we must compare that to the cost per week of having one more worker. So we want to compare apples and apples. Now the logic behind the answer of labor being 3, so L equals 3, is the same as same marginal analysis that you have seen in other contexts in previous chapters. At any L smaller than L equal 3, you can increase the profit by hiring another worker. So from all the way up to 3, you can actually increase the profit. For example, suppose Jack has 2 workers, and then he has L equals 2, and the value marginal product of labor is greater than wage. In other words, an increase in the revenue from hiring one more worker exceeds the increase in cost of wage. So hiring one more worker would increase profit. At any labor pool, any L larger than 3, you can increase profit by hiring one fewer worker. So essentially, you find the turning point where if you recall back one of the previous slides, Farmer Jack is going to keep hiring workers up until the point that he's no longer making additional profit. Okay, so at a labor 1, he's making a profit. He adds a second labor, he's still making a profit. Labor 3 starts to break even. Labor 4, he's actually losing profits. Okay, now suppose Jack has 4 workers at L equals 4. The value of marginal product of labor is less than W. In other words, the revenue from the 4th worker is less than the cost of that worker. So Jack can increase profit by hiring one fewer worker. Okay. Here you see the values on the left-hand side. We're going to have to pay them, if you imagine here, $2,500. If you imagine a line across here, okay? Anything beyond the 3, so imagine the line would be perfectly in between all these squares right here, okay? That happens to meet 3 right here. Anything after 3, the wage would be higher than the value of their marginal product of labor. It would be $2,000 and $1,000, so below $2,500. Anything before the 3, if you imagine a line right here, okay? In labor here, you're certainly making more money. Labor here, you're making more than $2,500. Labor here, you're making more than $2,500. Up until 3, you're making more than the weekly cost of wage. This is the weekly output that you would get. And anywhere before that, you're making more money. Okay. Again, illustrated here. Went back too far. Illustrated here. What point, if we know that in a week it's going to cost us $2,500 for workers, at what point do we stop adding workers? Well, 5,000 is greater than 2,500, so you add 1 worker. 4,000 is greater than 2,500, so you add another worker up to 2. 3,000 is greater than 2,500, the weekly wage you'd have to pay your worker. So the value of marginal product of labor, 3,000, is greater than the $2,500 a week wage. So you add a 3rd worker. But if you go to add a 4th worker, the wages of that worker, $2,500 a week, is going to be more than your value of marginal product of labor. So you cut off at 3 workers. Okay. So again, the line is here with 2,500. Okay. You don't want to go past 3 workers. All right. At any smaller labor pool, smaller than 3, you can make more money. You want to get all this area that's above your cost. Okay, but anything after 3, you're losing money. The wage that you're going to pay them is greater than what you're going to benefit from them in terms of the value of marginal product of labor. Hopefully that's a little more clear. I got the blue line to pop up there the second time through. Apologize for the initial attempt. All right, so for any competitive profit maximizing firm, to maximize profits, you hire workers up until the point where the value of marginal product of labor equals wage. So you get all that area that's above your wage costs. So the value of marginal product curve is the labor demand curve. So this VMPL becomes your demand for labor. Okay, so it even looks like a demand curve. Now, shifts in the labor demand. Okay, so now we moved away from saying it's just VMPL, easy for me to say, value of marginal product of labor, and we just call it demand. The labor demand curve equals the value of marginal product of labor to curve, and the value of marginal product is simply the price times marginal product of labor. So that's your one cost that we're considering in this example. So that determines your demand for labor. Anything that increases price or marginal product of labor at each labor level, each L, will increase the value of the marginal product of labor and shift the demand curve upward. Okay, so if you're getting more money you're getting more output, which means you're getting more value for your output, you're getting more money from your output, you're going to be willing to hire more labor. Now, things that shift the labor demand curve, changes in the output price P and technological changes can affect the marginal product of labor. The supply of other factors affects the marginal product of labor. An example would be if a firm gets more equipment, which is capital, then workers will be more productive. The marginal product of labor and the value of the marginal product of labor, because they're using the equipment, rise. Labor demand shifts upward. You've got this great new invention to produce wheat. Say it's a combine, a tractor, or something that helps you produce more of it. You need people to run that combine or tractor. Okay. Now, this example in the third point implies that the firm sees factor of inputs as complements and not substitutes. In many cases, there may be situations where you replace labor with capital. You think of like real old school agriculture, people were picking crops and threshing wheat and doing a lot of the manual labor, but they've been replaced by machines like advanced combines and things like that. So another example would be industrial robots have displaced some workers in the auto industry. Though the use of robots has increased the demand for other types of workers for that industry. For example, you need skilled labor to be able to run the robots, repair the robots, and maintain the robots. So it just shifts the emphasis of where labor is. So there's a connection between input demand and output supply. Recall that marginal cost, MC, is simply the cost of producing an additional unit of output. So what does it cost me to produce one more unit of output as a firm? This can be translated as the change in total cost given the change in quantity. So say I'll produce one more quantity, how does that affect my total cost? So that's your marginal cost to produce one more. Remember in economics, marginal means what's my cost, marginal means one more. So in this example, it's what's my cost to produce one more. Where total cost is, or TC equals the total cost, of course. Now, suppose the wage, again, is $2,500, okay? And the marginal product of labor is 500 bushels. So if you hire one more worker, you're going to get $500 more in bushels. If Farmer Jack hires another worker, his total cost is $2,500. That's the wage of one more worker. His total cost is $2,500. The expected change in output is 500 more bushels. We know that we're getting $5 per bushel. The marginal cost then is $2,500 divided by 5, which is $5 per bushel. So your marginal revenue for selling a bushel is $5. So 500 bushels times $5 is $2,500, and then hiring one more worker, your marginal cost is $2,500. So we're operating where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. Okay, so in general, marginal cost equals the wage divided by marginal product of labor. So again, your cost for one more worker is $2,500 your wage over your marginal product of labor, which is 500 more bushels. Okay, so that's your marginal cost. This and the next two slides cover materials from the FYI box entitled Input Demand and Output Supply, Two Sides of the Same Coin, which appears in your text. This slide establishes the relationship between marginal cost and marginal product. Okay, see the marginal cost down here is a factor, or marginal product of labor is a factor of marginal cost. Okay, depending on what your workers cost you versus what they can give you, is a very important concept when relating marginal cost and marginal product. Now, in general, again, marginal cost equals the wage over the marginal product of labor, okay, what they produce over what they cost, or excuse me, what they cost over what they produce, I should say. You need to notice here that to produce additional output, they have to hire more labor. Now, as labor rises, you remember you have a diminishing marginal product of labor. Okay, so marginal product of labor falls, which causes the ratio, the marginal cost ratio of wage over marginal product of labor to rise, because wage stays the same, but marginal product is going down. So that's rising, right? Causing marginal cost to rise. So we have a diminishing marginal product, which means that your marginal costs are creeping up. When you have diminishing production of wheat in this example, you're getting less and less wheat as you hire more people, which means your costs are going up at a steady rate and your output is coming down. So marginal cost rises. All right, that's wage over marginal product of labor. Hence, the diminishing marginal product and the increase in marginal cost are two sides of the same coin. Okay, going back to the FYI box. Now, this slide shows the connection between diminishing marginal product and increasing marginal cost. This next slide, we're going to talk about the connection between input demand and output supply. A competitive firm's rule for demanding labor, so their rule is that the wage should equal the marginal product of labor times price. Now, long run, this is known as operating where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. Price times marginal product of labor being marginal revenue. Hire one more person. What do they produce times the price versus their wage? Okay, you never want to get in a situation where you're paying them more than they're worth. Okay, so you operate where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. Marginal cost here equals marginal revenue here. Okay, divide both sides by marginal product of labor. Then you end up with price equals the wage over marginal product of labor. You can substitute marginal cost for wage over marginal product of labor from the previous slide, and thus you get price, which is essentially your marginal revenue for one more bushel, equal to marginal cost. This is a competitive firm's rule for supplying output, basically where marginal revenue price equals marginal cost of hiring one more worker. So that will help you determine whether or not you should keep hiring there, Farmer Jack. Hence, the input demand and the output supply are two sides of the same coin. Again, the FYI box you'll find in your textbook. This slide shows that when a competitive firm hires labor to a point where wage equals value of the marginal product of labor, it's also producing output to a point where price equals marginal cost. They're all one and the same in this example. Hence, the input demand and output supply are two sides of the same coin. Again, I keep hinting at that FYI box. You might want to take a look at it. Now, let's switch gears to labor supply. The trade-off between work and leisure. Okay, think about this as you. The more time you spend working, the less time you have for leisure. There's an opportunity cost there. The opportunity cost of leisure is wage, and the opportunity cost of wage is leisure. Now, looking at the labor supply curve, an increase in wage is an increase in the opportunity cost of leisure. So if you can get paid more to work, it costs you more to have leisure. Okay, people respond by taking less leisure then and working more. At this point, the book briefly discusses the income and substitution effects. This discussion is somewhat intuitive, and the actual terms income and substitution effects appear only kind of anecdotally. The book concedes that the possibility that the labor supply curve might bend backward if the income effect exceeds the substitution effect. So there could be some funky things going on there. But it also states that we would ignore this possibility for now and assume the labor supply curve is positively sloped. So we're going to keep things simple for now. It may not be so straight in the real world is all I'm saying. Things that shift the labor supply curve include changes in tastes and attitudes regarding labor and leisure time trade-off. It could be a cultural thing. Many European countries value leisure a lot higher than Americans usually do. So it could be some kind of trade-off, tastes and attitudes there. Opportunities for workers in other labor markets. People could go work abroad, or we could have immigration where people are coming here to work. So regarding the first point, the textbook notes that the change in attitudes about female labor force participation over the last 50 years has dramatically shifted the labor curve rightward. Fellas, females are here to stay in the workforce, and they're doing a darn good job. Okay, sorry, I just skipped the back a few slides. My apologies. Here we go. Now, there's an equilibrium in a labor market, just like there is in any other market. The wage adjusts to balance supply and demand for labor. The wage always equals the value of marginal product of labor for all the reasons we stated before. You don't want to pay people more than what they're worth, what they're producing. Okay, so you work them right up to the point that they equal the value of the marginal product of labor. Essentially, marginal revenue from labor equals marginal cost. Let's work through an example. Sorry. Here we go. There we go. In our example here, we examine changes in the labor market equilibrium. Each of the following scenarios use a diagram of the market for domestic auto workers to find the effects of their wage and employment. We have A, B, and C here. In A, baby boomers who worked in the auto industry retire. In B, car buyers' preferences shift towards imported autos. And C, technological progress boosts productivity in the auto manufacturing industry. Again, these exercises are not difficult, but you learn more by thinking through them on your own. So if you want to pause here and consider them, you can. I'd encourage you to do that. The exercise in part C will segue nicely to the case study on productivity and wages that follows in this presentation. So let's look at A. The retirement of baby boomer auto workers shifts the supply leftward. You had a bunch of people out here that were working. They were about to retire. Where they retire, you have a reduction in supply. When there's less workers, you're going to pay a higher wage. So wage rises, and the labor force falls. Okay. And this scenario, in fact, will actually occur in the coming decade and a half. We're going to have a lot of people retire. So there'll be less workers, so the worker's more valuable, so wage goes up. When there's less workers, L falls. Scenario B, a fall in the demand for U.S. autos reduces price, so people want more foreign cars, so the demand falls for the market for auto workers because the demand fell. Okay. At each labor, the value of marginal product of labor falls. Now the labor demand curve shifts down, okay, because people won't. There's a fall in demand for U.S. autos, so they need less workers, which means that both both wages and labor fall. Try to make up a new word there called labor. That would be more efficient, but you wouldn't understand what I'm saying. So wage drops, labor drops. Scenario C. The market for auto workers. At each labor level, marginal product of labor rises due to the technological progress given in section C. Means we can produce more. Makes the workers, let's say, in this scenario, obviously the capital and the laborers are complements. The capital does not replace the wage earners. They do not replace labor. They actually enhance what they can do. And the value of marginal product of labor rises, and the labor demand curve shifts upward. So this is the demand for auto workers. Okay, so they demand more to work with this new tech, which can produce more. So wages go up and labor goes up. Now, this slide covers material discussed in the chapter in the case study entitled Productivity and Wages. The data on this slide and analysis on the preceding one showed that technological progress benefits workers by increasing real wages. So that's an interesting case study. Now recall, one of the 10 principles of economics is that a country's standard of living depends on its ability to produce goods and services, G&S, abbreviated here. Our theory implies wages are tied to labor productivity. If you recall, wages, your marginal cost, is tied to your value or marginal product of labor, which is your marginal revenue. So we see this in this data. You see different time periods here: 1959 to 2012, 59 to 73, 73 to 95, 95 to 2012. The growth rate of productivity and the growth rate of real wages. Pretty well tied at the hip. Now, let's cover a unique situation. This slide corresponds with the FYI box in this chapter. The FYI box concludes by noting that monopsonies are rare. They're just as pure monopolies or rare as product markets, but there are local labor markets in which a single firm has enough share of the labor market to produce to have market power to increase profit by paying lower wages. You think of a Walmart in a small town. Actually, the NFL is known as a monopsony. So what's a monopsony? Our analysis assumes that competitive labor markets, there are many buyers, i.e. firms, they're buyers of labor, and sellers, which are workers, people willing to sell their time to earn a wage. Imagine a small town where a single large employer is essentially the one buyer for labor in that town. They're a monopsony. A lot of towns where there's like a mill town where everybody's employed by the mill. It's a monopsony. It's a market with one buyer. There's one employer in town. The monopsony employer can use its market power to increase its profits by paying lower wages. Okay, you don't want to work here? There's nowhere else to work on. I don't have to pay you a lower wage, or I don't have to pay you a higher wage, rather. As a monopoly, economic activity earned a monopsony is below the socially optimal level. So just like a monopsony is below the social optimal level, causing a deadweight loss. Okay, they can operate when marginal cost equals marginal revenue, but this time the price they can come down to their demand curve for labor and pay a lower wage. So it's just like a monopoly turned upside down. Now, monopsonies are very rare in this real world. More popular example than the mill town with one employer. Essentially, the NFL, the NBA, MLB are monopsonies. Okay, a lot of people mistakenly call them monopolies on football or baseball or basketball, but actually, they're the one single buyer of talent in America for basketball players, for football players, for baseball players. Okay. If you want to play pro ball, that's where you have to go. So they're a single buyer of labor. Now, that means they have some control over wages. However, through collective bargaining and deals that major sports leagues have made with the government, players have gained rights to get higher wages, and obviously we've seen escalation in salaries. Now, it wasn't but just a few decades ago that was not the case. You had ball players that were working extra jobs because they weren't paid much. Because if they wanted to play ball, they had to play in the MLB, the NBA, or the NFL, and their wages weren't quite what they are today, obviously. So that was more of a back in the day monopsony example. Now, other factors of production. With land and capital, we must distinguish between the purchase price and the rental price. Now, purchase price is the price a person pays to own the factor indefinitely. A rental price is the price a person pays to use that factor for a limited period of time. So if you're going to buy something versus you're going to rent it. Okay, the price a person must pay indefinitely is the purchase price. The price the person must pay in a limited time is a rental price. Okay, the wage is essentially the rental price of labor. Okay, it's a short-run payment to rent your time as a worker. Now, the determination of rental prices of capital and land is analogous to the determination of wages. Okay, you have to rent maybe a factory, or you have to rent the land to use for production. Now, we have seen how workers are compensated, what determines how much the owners of land or capital earn for their contribution to the production process. First, to determine this, we must distinguish between the purchase price and the rental price of these factors, as illustrated on this slide. Then we apply the lessons we learned about wage determination to help us understand the determination of rental prices for capital and land. So we're moving away from wage and we're moving into capital and land. So how the rental price of land is determined. Firms, again, just like a market, the market for land, supply and demand, price at equilibrium, quantity at equilibrium. Here's the demand for land given its value of marginal product. So I buy one more acre and I can make X amount of more goods. Okay, that's the same thing as demand curve. Firms decide how much land to rent or purchase. In this example, rent by comparing the price with the value of the marginal product of the land. Okay, the rental price of the land adjusts to balance supply and demand for the land. So there's a market. All right. Now, how the rental price for capital is determined, again, same thing with supply and demand being analogous to the value of marginal product. So I buy one more unit of capital. What does that get me? The firms decide how much capital to rent by comparing the price with the value of the marginal product of capital. Okay. The rental price of capital adjusts to balance supply and demand for capital. Again, there's a market for land, there's a market for wages, and there's a market for capital. Now, rental and purchase prices. Buying a unit of capital or land yields a stream of rental income. Okay? The rental income in any period equals the value of the marginal product of labor. Okay? What income do I get from renting this land or capital? Is my value of marginal product of labor. What do I get by producing one more unit because I now have the rights to use this capital or this land to produce my goods? Hence, the equilibrium purchase price of a factor depends on both the current value of marginal product and the value of marginal product expected to prevail in future periods, because you're not just renting it for today, you're renting it for a year, 2 years, whatever. You're purchasing it for a year or 2 years. Now, regarding the first point, when a firm buys a unit of capital, it is likely to use that capital in its own production rather than rent it to the capital rental market. So they've purchased it for a reason. However, the opportunity cost of using its capital is a stream of rental income it could earn. So once they have acquired capital, they can either use it to produce their good or allow someone else to produce another good. Now, what you should do, obviously, is make sure that what you're using it to produce is its highest valued use. You're producing something that gives us the highest return. Now, if at some point you discover, hey, so-and-so over here could use my factory to produce something and we can make more money that way, that's the direction you would need to go at that point. So you're always considering opportunity cost, because we're talking about economic cost here and economic profits. So if a firm is using its own capital, we can infer that the capital is generating at least as much income as a stream of rental income, if not more, it would command in the rental market. So it's being used for its highest valued use. Now, there's linkages among factors of production. In most cases, factors of production are used together in a way that makes each factor's productivity dependent on the quantities of other factors. An example here is that an increase in the quantity of capital, a couple bullet points here with an increase in the quantity of capital. The marginal product and rental price of the capital fall, okay, that diminishing marginal return, and having more capital makes workers more productive. So we're assuming that marginal product of labor and wage rise. So if we're getting a higher marginal product of labor from workers using an increased capital, they're going to become more valuable, so that not only will our marginal product of labor rise, but also will their wages. Lots of moving parts here. Don't worry. In conclusion, the theory in this chapter is called the neoclassical theory of income distribution. It states simply that factor prices are determined by supply and demand. There's a supply and demand on market for inputs, okay, for factors of production inputs like labor, like capital, like land. Each factor is paid the value of its marginal product. So you're only going to want to buy one more if it's making you more money, okay? Most economists use this theory as a starting point for understanding the distribution of income. Okay, we're going to get there eventually, but it's a starting point for the distribution of income. That's why it's in the first of 3 chapters discussing the distribution of income. The next 2 chapters further explore income distribution and related issues. So in summary, it's a very kind of conceptual chapter, introduces labor, capital, and land, but it's simply just a review of those things being in a market of their own with supply and demand, which is very simple. The economy's income distribution is determined in the markets for factors of production, again, things you need to produce things. The 3 most important factors of production are labor, land, and capital. A firm's demand for a factor like labor, land, or capital is derived from its supply of output. Okay, you need to produce more output, you're going to need more labor, land, and capital. Competitive firms maximize profit by hiring each factor up to the point where its value of marginal product equals its rental price. So it's marginal product equals its marginal cost, or its marginal revenue because marginal cost, I should say. The value you get from producing one more, we want to utilize that all the way up until the point that it equals the cost of producing one more. Okay, you don't want to hire a wage above what you're making from that wage. Okay, so you don't want to hire labor, and pay them a wage that's going to be higher than what you can make off that labor. You don't want to buy land beyond a point where you can't make additional money from that land. You don't want to do the same thing with capital. You don't want to pay for capital that's not going to make you additional money. Now, continuing this summary, the supply of labor rises from the trade-off between work and leisure and yields an upward sloping labor supply curve. The price paid to each factor adjusts to balance and supply and demand for that factor. In equilibrium, each factor is compensated according to its marginal contribution of production, and factors of production are used together, i.e. you use land, capital, labor all together. A change in the quantity of one factor affects the marginal products and equilibrium earnings of all factors. So think about it as a recipe as a soup. You get a little bit of labor, you get a little bit of land, and a little bit of capital. You gotta make your soup to where it tastes the best, and where it's going to taste the best is where you maximize your marginal product of labor without going past the point where it equals your marginal cost. So that's why firms want to operate where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. Okay, this concludes the chapter on markets for factors production PowerPoint video. Again, this accompanies the in-class lecture, and also the reading will make things a lot clearer. We referenced the reading several times throughout this, so make sure you're doing that. And let me know if you have any questions. You can contact me at office hours via phone, email, or just drop by. Thank you.